Good evening. I'm Ryan Bujan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and 2024 sees the 70th anniversary of one of director Alfred Hitchcock's most beloved suspense thrillers. From 1954, it's Rear Window, starring the lovable Jimmy Stewart, the future Princess of Monaco, Grace Kelly, and television's Perry Mason, Raymond Burr. Joining us tonight is esteemed novelist. He is a film historian and critic, Mr. Kim Newman. How are you doing tonight, Kim?
Very well. I'm very glad to be here.
As a fan of your work as a reader, I know you're quite prolific within the horror genre. Now, Rear Window is an interesting film because I don't know if you could sum it up as being specifically a horror film, but certainly the implications are horrific.
Oh, absolutely. But Hitchcock exists quite a lot. I mean, he was somebody who could actually say that there was a Hitchcock genre, and I think of it as that, yeah, a twilight zone, as it were, between horror and suspense. And actually, I think if you look at it, the bulk of his films, they fall into other categories. They're like espionage movies, chase movies. This is kind of a chase movie in one room. And the legacy he gives to horror is, I suppose, Psycho is the slasher movie, the psycho thriller. Very few of his films are about professional criminals or professional crooks. You have even if you have professional spies, they're usually opposed by amateurs. I think this has a lot to do with the kind of fiction that was popular when he was a young man, when he was a kid. He would have grown up reading John Buchan, who wrote The 39 Steps, but also Bulldog Drummond, which sort of informs the first version of The Man Who Knew Too Much. It was going to be a Bulldog Drummond story. But these ideas of sort of restless, rootless people kicking around the world who become the focus or notice something wrong and spot that there is there's a terrible, almost monolithic injustice out there, which ends up being directed at just one person. Quite often, he does the idea of the wrong man, the innocent man on the run, who circumstances or malign entities have made look astonishingly guilty. Um, but also, that's just the worldview of the paranoid, is that they're all out to get me. Hitchcock famously disliked the police, and the authorities in his films are all terrifyingly inept. And even if they are not inept, as in Rear Window, they're sort of benignly disinterested. Rear Window is about a man who nobody listens to. It's actually the underlying story is the boy who cried wolf, isn't it? The character who sort of says that there's something wrong to such an extent that people get fed up with it, even when there is something wrong.
A lot of people in the audience, they may be familiar with Hitchcock's later work, the films of the late 1950s and 60s, but they may not realize that he had a career stretching back to the silent era. And he was really one of those pioneers who was consistently improving his craft and taking things to the next level. So 1954, where was Hitchcock at this point in his career?
Well, he's almost going into the third of his third act, yeah, because he had a whole career in Britain, starting out in the silent era, actually partly in Germany, but mostly in Britain. He made a movie called The Lodger with the matinee idol Ivan Novello, which is it's an early serial killer story. It's based on a book which is about Jack the Ripper, although the film is a contemporary 1920s story, and it's about a man who's mistaken for a serial killer. It's the wrong man theme again. He made Britain's first talking picture, Black Male. And then in the 30s, he became known for a run of very popular chase thrillers. The 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes, The Man Who Knew Too Much. These are all, actually, they're endlessly rewatchable. I've done all of Hitchcock's 30s films recently, and they zip through. Um, he adapted serious novels. He did Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent. which he called Sabotage, and he followed up with a film called The Secret Agent, which is based on a Somerset Maugham series of stories. But in the late 1930s, David O. Selznick, the great American producer, hired him to come over to Hollywood and put him under contract. The big project that got in there was Rebecca, the Daphne du Maurier novel, which was a bestseller. It's a very British book. It's weirdly, although it's Hitchcock's first American film, it's a very British movie, except for the ending, which is imposed by censorship, and I think actually kind of ruins the movie. And it won the Best Picture Oscar for Selznick the year after he'd won for Gone with the Wind. So that was like his shining moment. But the thing about Rebecca is it's a David O. Selznick film, not an Alfred Hitchcock film. And I think Alfred Hitchcock started to bristle under that. He made other films for Selznick, some brilliant in the 1940s, Notorious. But he also made a few films away from Selznick, which are more personal to him. He said his favorite film was Shadow of a Doubt, which is another serial killer story with Joseph Cotton. But he made a bunch of other things, Suspicion with Cary Grant. But by the end of the 1940s, there must have been a sense that he was flagging a bit. He had a run of flops. He had a run of films that actually look quite interesting now, but didn't work then. I Confess is one, Under Capricorn. These sort of and yet at some point, I think probably his comeback was Strangers on a Train in 1951, the Patricia Highsmith novel. And that reestablished him as somebody who could deliver a really entertaining thriller that also had a lot of depth and a lot of guts and a lot of heart. But in the mid 1950s, he got out from under David O. Selznick. He realized that in order to become Alfred Hitchcock, he had to become Alfred Hitchcock, the producer, as well as Alfred Hitchcock, the director, because he got fed up with listening to producers telling him what to do and to change things and to do stuff he didn't want to. So he became a producer. He produced his own films, but he also became one of the first major Hollywood figures to really go into television. And Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the TV series he did in the mid-50s, I mean, it made him not just a producer and a director, but a celebrity. You imitated his voice earlier on because of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, because you know he sounds like he's in all his films, but he doesn't have any dialogue in there. And I think he did it partly as an expression of the fact he was a natural showman and a ham, and he loved doing that stuff. But he was also aware that by becoming really famous, he had more power. He had more control over what he could do. And at the time that Alfred Hitchcock was on the air, from in Alfred Hitchcock Presents, followed by the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, at the same time, he is making this run of the films we now think of as the masterpieces. Rear Window, Vertigo, Psycho, The Birds, Marnie, In There Is the Wrong Man, The Trouble with Harry, North by Northwest. This is like your box set of the great Hitchcock movies. These are the films they're still imitating, remaking, referencing, rebooting. All this material is still coming over and over again. And quite a lot of and Vertigo is in there as well, which is sometimes rated the best film of all time. Quite a lot of these films start with little nuggets that could have been Alfred Hitchcock Presents. They could have been half-hour suspense stories. And Rear Window in particular is that because it's a short story by Cornell Woolrich. Cornell Woolrich, also known as William Irish, is one of the great pulp noir mystery suspense writers of the 20th century. There's a whole filmography of great movies based on his work. Phantom Lady is a particular favorite of mine. Night Has a Thousand Eyes. Lots of delirious stories about amnesiac fugues, people who spot murders and can't get other people to believe them. All this stuff that actually feeds into Rear Window, which is a very concentrated story. It could have been done as a 30-minute TV episode just with what's in the story, but Hitchcock saw more in it, wanted to do more with it. A thing that I think is not often talked about in terms of how brilliant Alfred Hitchcock was is that he was a techie. It takes a lot to be the first man to make a talking picture in Britain. And then at a time when everybody else who's making talking pictures is trying to get every single word of dialogue audible on the soundtrack, to actually blur a whole speech so only a single word is absolutely audible, the word knife in a long monologue. And it's to do with the heroine who has stabbed someone. Every time she hears the word knife, yeah, it's like she's stabbing her own mind. That's the invention of the talkies right there. It's not Al Jolson singing. It's not, people in drawing rooms speaking very clearly and precisely. It's when you realize that what you can't hear, what you don't hear, what you strain to hear is important. So he experimented with long takes in a movie called Rope. And Rear Window is an experimental film. It's an all-in-one-room film in the way that quite often low-budget filmmakers today will do that. Will make a movie that's just one room or somebody buried alive or whatever. And there's the whole thing of if you're in one room and you've got a window and you look out of it and you peep into the worlds of the people around you, as the James Stewart character does, you become, a cinema audience. Yeah, there's the idea that an audience will identify with a voyeur. It's a great part of Hitchcock's strategy in almost all his films. If you didn't have a murder in Rear Window, it would be an art movie. Yeah, it would be a story of a bored man looking out the window, projecting his fantasies and desires and interests, and all his neighbors, not just the murderer, are interesting. They're all the idea that you look at people and you make up stories about them. It's fascinating. You could actually make a quirky, quixotic, interesting little slice of life art movie about that. But it's a Hitchcock movie, so somebody's dead. So someone has committed a murder, and that becomes the dominant thread, the theme, the all-encompassing part of the picture everybody remembers. But I think what makes it work is all the stuff around it.
Now, let me ask you, if we have anyone in the audience today who has never seen Rear Window before, what do they have to look forward to?
I think they have to look forward to a surprising amount of humor. I think it's a very funny film. You talked about who's in it earlier, and yeah, there are great iconic stars in it. Particularly look at Thelma Ritter's performance. Every time I see this film, I think she walks away with it. And again, it's a part that's just a convenience. She's just there to be a sounding board. And yet what she does with it, and this is something I think Hitchcock is really invested in. He loves character actors. He quite often has odd, eccentric commentator characters in his films. Often I think they represent him. And I think Thelma Ritter in particular does here. I think it's an absolute model of structure, of story, of pulling you in. And of course, it has to be, because it's about somebody who is pulled into a story. It's deeply metafictional and clever and academic in all those kind of ways. But the reason people keep going back to it is just so entertaining. It has that ancient mariner grab you by the lapel and tell you this story feel to it. Don't want to give away too much about the plot because it's very, very clever. And I think there's a lot going on under the surface. I think you come out of it understanding what has happened, but with questions about the characters. And I think that's the best kind of story, the kind of story you want to chew over afterwards.
Well, certainly, we have a lot to look forward to this afternoon. Mr. Kim Newman, thank you so much for your time. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1954, director Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. For a movie that's set almost entirely in one location, this really is roller coaster ride.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't even do the really tricksy stuff. There's not actually that much clever camera work or moving camera. It's all done in blocking, isn't it? It's kind of stagey and I think an interesting way because it does want you to be stuck there with him. I I love the whole thing of sitting in the dark as the yeah. I suppose it may actually be one of the first films that you could say is about television. It's because that's essentially what Jimmy Stewart is doing, isn't he? He's watching television. He's watching the bank of screens as they light up, and little stories play out in front of him. Yeah.
That's right. And you know what? I'm curious. Now, you referenced the Cornell Woolrich novella earlier, and Hitchcock does something interesting. And most of his films of this era, actually, when I think about it, when you think of Jimmy Stewart's character, the way that he's kind of, it almost seems like he's written to be a younger man, that, oh, he's not ready for marriage. He doesn't want to settle down with Grace Kelly, of all people. It's like, well, first off, who would? And I feel like that's the biggest stretch of the film. But, he's written as kind of like almost kind of childish. He seems to be written as a much younger man in the way that even like Cary Grant in North by Northwest, who's kind of a mama's boy, and the actress playing his mother looks like they're the same age. So, like, was this casting? I mean, obviously, you want that star power, but was
Yeah,
this sort of like a tough?
it's
Yeah,
not just Hitchcock who did that. John Ford does the same with James Stewart in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance,
right.
where logically the Stewart character and the John Wayne character should be in their 20s and 30s, but they are middle-aged men. And there's a kind of get out clause in that it's old Jimmy Stewart remembering the past when he was young. But yeah, it's on. I think Stewart's career in the 1950s, which I suppose is the post-war career. It's the career that starts with It's a Wonderful Life after he came back from the war. And he's still youthful. He's still Mr. Smith from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but he's Mr. Smith comes back from war. And it's not, I say, Ford, Hitchcock, and Anthony Mann in a run of westerns really draw out from Stewart a kind of neurotic edge. And I suppose it's sort of, I don't know if it's reading too much into it to say that James Stewart, like many sort of male Hollywood leading men of the classic era of Hollywood, kind of represents America, how America feels. And in the 1950s, you've got this, outwardly, it's an optimistic, successful decade. Things are moving. There's not an actual war after Korea is finished. There's affluence. It's I Like Ike and all that kind of stuff, rock and roll. Yeah. And yet there are undertones. There is that sense that we come through the fires of the middle of the century, and we're now starting to question what we've got. And Stewart, more than any other actor, from It's a Wonderful Life onward, seems to be asking, the American dream, was it worth it? And even in, say, a film like this, which is essentially, a murder mystery or a murder story, a thriller, the undertone is so much James Stewart asking what it was all about, and the refusal to commit to Grace Kelly is strange, isn't it? And also, it's there are aspects of the relationship which now seem horribly imbalanced. The fact that he looks like her dad in quite a lot of things. Somehow, I always find weirdly, Cary Grant can actually get away with it. I never notice the age difference with Eva Marie Saint or the other actresses he played opposite, even Audrey Hepburn. Right? Yeah. Somehow I do get it with James Stewart. There's always something slightly skeevy about it, and I think having worked this out in Rear Window, Hitchcock then casts him in Vertigo, which is the the most blistering analysis of James Stewart and Younger Woman, but also the idea of the dominant middle-aged man trying to reshape a woman to suit his weird fantasies, which may even relate to Hitchcock's self-critique of the role of the director. Yeah, I mean, he does seem to feel that being a director isn't healthy.
Right. Well, I think it gets its most unrealistic. It's not even a Hitchcock film, but the same year they did Vertigo, you see Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak in Bell Book and Candle, which to me, that's even more ludicrous because you have the beautiful 25-year-old Kim Novak
Yeah.
trying to seduce Jimmy Stewart.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Although I love that film, but yeah,
It's a wonderful film. No, I love it. Yeah.
but yeah, I do wonder if that's a case where a younger actor of equal stature might have worked. I mean, I assume in late 50s, Rock Hudson perhaps would have,
Of course.
clicked with, or James Garner. There are all kinds of actors who might have fit better into that. But Stewart obviously stayed a top box office draw well into the 1960s. Um, and probably because he was such a natural screen actor. Hitchcock loved movie stars. I mean, he sought out and worked with movie stars all the way back to Ivan Novello. Um, it seemed to be something that he felt he needed as a way of expressing. I mean, he was not obviously a naturalist as a filmmaker, but he wanted the people in his films to be iconic, to be people you relate to. So even his like ordinary men are Montgomery Clift and Henry Fonda and Cary Grant,
Right.
or Robert Donat, Michael Redgrave. They are bigger than life. They are, I think he really pins the notion that we had that movie stars represented us. They were aspirational. They were who we wanted to be, who we looked at. Yeah, and some of them, and Cary Grant said that even he wanted to be Cary Grant. Yeah, the idea that you have this sort of a fantasy of who you are, but then Hitchcock was willing to put the screws on them, as it were, to make these people sweat. I suspect, and as everybody says, there was a kind of sadistic impulse to Hitchcock's approach. I think, I mean, he famously liked making, putting women in peril, but I think he did it to men as well. Certainly, Rear Window in particular is all about making somebody who's known for playing action heroes, somebody who'd won medals in a war, making him, the lady in distress, the heroine, the helpless one, by physically confining them to a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm curious too. As you mentioned earlier, anytime they put out a box set of the Alfred Hitchcock Essentials, Rear Window is always near the top of the list. But what was the reception like when it was released?
It was a huge hit. I mean, it probably started a run, and actually one or two of the Hitchcocks we really like, Vertigo, didn't particularly click, but Rear Window, Psycho, North by Northwest, these were like top 10 films of the year. These films everybody saw, everybody talked about. Rear Window, like Vertigo and a couple of other films, there was the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much with Jimmy Stewart around that time, and The Trouble with Harry, which is I know one of Hitchcock's personal favorites. They were unavailable for decades. There was a rights quirk, and I think the rights reverted to Hitchcock, who wouldn't re-release them. I'm not sure what the business details were, but from quite soon after release, from sort of the late 1960s on, these films were out of circulation. So naturally, that made them more interesting to fans. They became stories. They became films that you knew somebody who'd seen, and they would tell you how great they were, but you couldn't see them. I mean, I vividly remember in the 1980s when these films finally came out again, and we all trooped up off to see them as if they were new films. What a revelation they were, in terms that they were as good as we'd been told, which sometimes isn't the case with the the wonder films of your parents or your older siblings. Yeah, dim memories of the things they saw that you didn't. But maybe because they come from a period where Hitchcock really had a popular touch. He seemed to be in tune with audiences. I don't think any artist can actually sustain that for an absolutely extended period. I think Hitchcock had periods when he was in tune with audiences and periods when he wasn't. Um, but when he was, I mean, he was probably the most famous director in the world. How many other film directors have got their own theme tune? Yeah. Steven Spielberg doesn't have a theme tune. Alfred Hitchcock does. You can hum that bit of Gounod and know it. You know exactly what that reference is. And I think that he constructed that. He set out to do it deliberately. But I think that it gave him power. It also means that you have a body of work which is a body of work rather than a bunch of one-offs. You can actually enjoy Hitchcock in a box set sense. You see themes grow and build and recur and repeat all the way from 1927 to Family Plot. I think maybe a film whose reputation is going to keep going up. I think maybe some of currently the general thinking is that Vertigo is Hitchcock's best film. I think Vertigo is a masterpiece. I prefer Rear Window. There are one or two others. I think Notorious is my favorite Hitchcock, but Rear Window is top three. Top three. I think the Psycho sentimentally for me is in there as well, but I think it's a film that will stay with people.
Certainly, certainly. Well, as I mentioned earlier, you wear many hats as a writer, a film critic, a novelist. Is there anything you're working on right now or anything that's just come out that you want the audience to know about?
My next published book is out at Christmas, and it is called A Christmas Ghost Story, and it's a novella, which is exactly what it sounds like.
All right, wonderful. Well, Kim Newman, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Happy to be here.
If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film today as much as we do. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.